In the meantime, let's go to our panel. Bruce Hawker joins me now. Bruce, we've seen, of course, a number of government ministers out and about today really pushing the compensation measures that go along with the carbon tax. But do you think Australians are still listening to what they have to say, or are their minds made up on the tax?
Well, I think attitudes have hardened over a period of time, actually. There's very little doubt about that, and polling today seems to suggest that. But the government does have an opportunity. The Prime Minister has staked a lot on being able to convince the public through an advertising campaign and just through the force of argument that, you know, the sky is not going to fall in. And of course, part of that will be whether, you know, people do feel better after they start receiving the compensation payments for this tax. That's the big issue. When the money starts flowing in, will people say, look, I think we were sold a pup by Tony Abbott, this isn't the end of the world at all, or they may still feel aggrieved. I think that the attitudes against it will soften, but how far they're going to soften, I'm not so sure. I think it'll still be a hard sell.
We'll get the other side of the story with Grahame Morris on our panel very shortly, but I am told that clip with Wayne Swan is now ready to play to you again. We'll give it another go. The Treasurer speaking with me earlier. Treasurer, thank you for your time. We've known about the compensation plans for months now, but still today we see 2/3 of Australians opposing the carbon tax. Do you really expect that'll change a lot before the next election?
Well, this is a very significant economic and environmental reform, which does have a small impact on the overall price level. But of course, there's been a lot of distortion, particularly from Mr Abbott, about the impact. So I think the lived experience of millions of Australians will be that the price impacts that are taken into account in terms of the additional assistance through the tripling of the tax-free threshold, the additional family payments and so on will be evident to Australians. That'll be their lived experience.
You've modelled the household impacts, but what about the impacts on jobs? Have you done any specific modelling which tells you how many jobs are going to be lost as a result of the carbon tax?
Yes, we have, and what it shows is that jobs will continue to grow strongly in this country over the next decade. We've done a lot of modelling in terms of economic growth, in terms of jobs growth and in terms of income growth, and it is the case that we will continue to grow strongly.
As we know, Tony Abbott keeps saying he's going to repeal the carbon tax. Labor seems very critical of that, certainly suggesting that Mr Abbott won't carry through with it. Why is that? Why do you think that repealing the carbon tax should be or is in the too hard basket?
Well, I think business is aware that we're putting in place a carbon price which is going to drive investment, most particularly in energy efficiency and in renewable energy. Trying to rip that out would create an enormous amount of uncertainty. You see, the reason why many businesses support a carbon price is it provides the investment certainty so they can grow. It generates the investment in renewable energy and more efficient energy use practices. This does provide the certainty, and I think there'll be many businesses out there, including the ones in the paper today, who will be opposing Mr Abbott tooth and nail if he tries to rip it out. But Australians also would be shocked to hear that he plans to get rid of the changes in the tax system, which are very, very important for people on low and modest incomes, not paying $1 of tax until $18,200.
You mentioned the tax breaks for low-income earners, but for the first time in years, we're actually seeing an increase in the marginal tax rates. The 15% rate is going to 19%, the 30% rate is going to 32.5%. Why were those tax hikes necessary?
Well, we've put in place a tax cut which flows through right up to $80,000. The fact is that people up to that level will receive a tax cut. There have been adjustments in terms of the marginal rates, but that's because the tax-free threshold has increased from $6,000 to $18,200. So everyone up to $80,000 will be better off.
If you do lose the election, as the polls suggest, Labor wouldn't be able to hold on to this carbon tax policy, would it? Wouldn't you need to do what the Coalition did with work choices and essentially acknowledge the Coalition's mandate on this issue?
I'm not going to speculate about that, but the fact is, and we've just said in this interview, that there are a set of arrangements which are put in place which support investment, particularly in renewable energy and power generation, a set of arrangements in the tax system which encourage workforce participation. They're all pretty important, and I think Mr Abbott would be mugged by reality if he were to be elected Prime Minister of Australia, which I regard as still highly unlikely, because his behaviour during this debate during this debate demonstrates that he's not fit to hold the high office of Prime Minister.
Well, what also appears likely, if these polls are right, is that you actually won't have a seat after the next election, that you'd be voted out. Clive Palmer has said that he's planning to run in the seat of Lilly. We're expecting an announcement from him further on this tomorrow. Do you have any inside word on whether or not he will indeed run?
Well, I certainly hope he doesn't skulk off and run away from this contest. He's going to be the biggest beneficiary of the tax cut Mr Abbott is going to give, which is the tax cut to the big miners. He's going to abolish the mining tax. And, of course, that will be a huge benefit to Mr Palmer and Gina Rinehart. So I hope he doesn't run away from the contest in Lilly, because I want to have that contest with him about these very important issues that matter so much to the people who live in the electorate that I'm privileged to represent.
If the polls don't improve, it's likely we'll see more pressure on Julia Gillard's leadership, isn't it?
I don't accept the premise behind that question. The fact is that we are putting in place a very important economic and environmental reform. It has always been the case in the past when governments have moved to put in place big reforms like this that it strips some paint off. And there's no doubt it's done this. But what we've done is the right thing by the country, and I believe that that will be rewarded at the next election.
Treasurer, just finally, at the start of this new financial year, what are you expecting? Do you think the uncertainty on global markets is going to continue, or are you feeling more optimistic?
Look, I was encouraged, Ash, at the events in Europe over the weekend. I thought we did see the beginnings of an important breakthrough there at the meetings that took place in the European Union.
And clearly some more gremlins in the system with that interview with the Treasurer, Wayne Swan. And apologies to him, some of the follow-up questions I did ask there didn't make it into that compile because we had some problems with the recording of that interview a little earlier. You got the gist of it, though. Let's move on back to our panel. Bruce Hawker and Grahame Morris are with me now. Let's start with you, Grahame. You heard the Treasurer there sounding optimistic that Australians will come around, that they will eventually think the carbon tax is a good idea once this compensation starts flowing into their pockets. Do you think there's any chance that hope will become a reality for Labor?
Well, I think the Labor Party is relying on hope at the moment. You know, this time last year, the Prime Minister and the Treasurer were saying, look, wait until the compensation is announced. And then it was wait until Christmas, everything will calm down. Then it was wait until the budget and there'll be a new announcement. Then it was wait until the implementation of some of these good things. Then wait until the advertising campaign kicks in. And now we're here and everyone is saying, oh, wait until the tax returns next year. I think the Labor Party has been very, very, very tolerant with the Prime Minister and with the Treasurer. And I suspect at the moment they know that this is a dog of a policy. And their only hope, to me, and listening to them, is that they know that behind the door is Kevin Rudd and Bill Shorten. But I'm starting to think if I were advising Kevin Rudd, I'd be saying, look, I've had enough of this. I got you out of trouble once. I'm not going to do it again. You can stick with Prime Minister Gillard and see how you go. You know, why should he, in this climate, which is now absolutely dreadful, with 500 days to go before the election, the Labor Party is in a no-win position. Why should Kevin Rudd a second time put up his hand and say, I'll get you out of this mire? I don't think perhaps he should anymore.
Well, Bruce Hawker, of course, we all know that you're close to Kevin Rudd. Do you think that Julia Gillard's time is running out in the top job? How long do you think Labor and the backbenchers would be happy to really wait around with her if we don't see these polls starting to turn around in the next couple of months?
Well, the parliamentary party's shown a great enthusiasm to support Julia Gillard in really tough situations. They're quite dogged in their support for her. I don't think I'm in any position to predict how the Labor Party caucus is going to react in the coming months. Although I would say that she's made it pretty clear that she believes that she can argue the case for the carbon tax between now and the end of the year, and that she would expect to see some turnaround in the polling. And I think everyone would be desperately looking for that. I mean, the poll numbers in Queensland today were just so terribly depressing. I think we're at 22%. which would just see the whole of the parliamentary party in Queensland, including Kevin Rudd, wiped out. So everyone knows that there's a lot riding on being able to turn around public opinion on carbon. As I said to you before, I think she can go some way towards it. However, I suspect that a lot of attitudes have hardened in the last weeks and months, and it's going to be very difficult to get a big change unless people really do accept that the compensation package they're going to get more than compensates for any loss of income as a result of the introduction of the tax.
Bruce, can I just clarify with you, is it your understanding that Kevin Rudd wouldn't challenge again, that he'd only come back if he was essentially begged by the caucus to do so?
It's my understanding that Kevin Rudd would not challenge again for the leadership. Apart from that, I can't make any speculation. I just do know that in the last round, it was a very scarifying experience for everybody involved in that process. A lot of people made their positions very clear about what they felt about Kevin Rudd, which I think drove a lot of the caucus vote on the issue. I think he would never challenge again for the leadership.
Yeah, Ashley, I've always thought that any politician, whether it's Kevin Rudd or Bill Shorten or someone like that if you're ever asked again to be Prime Minister or asked to be Prime Minister, even if it's just for a few months, you sort of put up your hand and say, yes, please, I would like to be Prime Minister of this country. But it's very hard to think of how you would go to Kevin Rudd now, how you would go to Bill Shorten, how you would go to Greg Combet and say, look, we know we're in a dreadful pickle, can you come and save us? I think there's this sort of fatalism in the Labor Party at the moment about their prospects under the Prime Minister, and they are all hoping that around the corner is a new leadership team. But what if the new leadership team isn't there? And what if they say, not that they won't challenge, but what if 20 people go to them and say, look, we need you, we've got the numbers now to knock off the Prime Minister, we'll go and tap her on the shoulder. What if they say, don't bother, I'm not going to start? Where is the Labor Party then? It is a very, very fatalistic caucus room at the moment, and they're not quite sure what the hell to do.
Well, of course, senior ministers and caucus members tell us all the time that this is not a big issue at the moment. Of course, all hoping that these polls are going to be turning around once Australians get used to the idea of the carbon tax. Grahame, do you think that Tony Abbott's overstepped the mark in his criticism against the carbon tax? Labor, of course, we've seen ministers rolled out over the last couple of days saying, well, look, the sky hasn't fallen in. These coal mining towns that Mr Abbott's been visiting over recent months, well, they're still here, they're still functioning. There hasn't been this huge wipeout of jobs in those regions.
Well, I don't think so, actually. We've had mums and dads with some money in their pocket, and they've gone to Big W and they've bought some kids' shoes and whatnot, but they're still not happy. Still not happy. And now we're going to get to the stage where small business particularly is being advised by people like the Institute of Chartered Accountants and everyone to just have a look at their costs and see what you can and cannot pass on. They've got to be very careful that they don't do something stupid and the ACCC comes down on them like a ton of bricks. But throughout the economy, every small business is entitled to have a look at their electricity prices, their transport prices, their refrigeration price, everything, and just pass it on to the consumer. And I don't think mums and dads are going to be terribly impressed in a couple of months' time when they've sort of taken any compensation, put it in their pocket, but they get all these extra bills. I just cannot see that this policy, the policy's no good, the personnel selling it is no good, and all of a sudden, or now, it's rubbing off on the party itself as being no good, and the electorate's almost given up on them. And that is very strange at this time of the election cycle.
Well, there is still a long way to go, as you point out, until the next election. I do want to ask you both for your thoughts on the asylum seeker debate we saw last week. As we've been reporting this afternoon, the Indonesian President Yudhoyono is in Darwin today. He's going to be meeting with the Prime Minister, and this is going to be the one of the issues that's really high up on the agenda. Bruce, do you think there was a winner at all out of that debate we saw in the Parliament last week?
Probably not. I think the polling suggests that the public, though, do want a compromise between the government and the opposition, and the opposition leader is refusing to do that. He knows, though, that while he keeps the ball in the ruck and refuses to come up with any solution to this issue, and he could come up with a compromise quite easily by accepting the Malaysian solution, that he's pretty much on a winner. So he's being very cynical about this, in my view, and I think he's being archly political about it. Now, on the one hand, that's bad for him because it paints him in a rather grim light, and that's why he's barely, got a popularity above Julia Gillard's when it comes to preferred Prime Minister, when you would expect, with the numbers that the government and the opposition have gotten in votes, that he would be way, way ahead. So that's the problem for him. The advantage is, of course, that while this issue continues to go along, it's going to be a problem for the government. But with the Indonesian president in the country at the moment, one thing that we should all remember is that Tony Abbott is saying he wants to tow those boats back to Indonesia that come here, even though Indonesia is not a signatory to the international rights on the refugees. So he's got one position on Malaysia and a totally inconsistent position on Indonesia, and I think the government needs to go to this constantly and really take the fight up to Tony Abbott on those inconsistencies in his approach.
And Graham, it's not just the Indonesians saying that policy of turning around the boats won't work. We've also heard senior Navy personnel expressing their concerns about that in terms of safety for our Navy personnel. Is it time for that part of the coalition's policy, which is just one part, along with, of course, reintroducing TPVs and also sending asylum seekers to Nauru? Is it that part of the policy, though, that the coalition should be just cutting off and saying goodbye to?
No. No, look, there are a lot of symbols in all of this, but look, it's not hard to sort out some sort of compromise. You just knock off Malaysia. That's not hard. But what I found interesting in this debate last week, you would expect the Prime Minister and the Labor Party to get in a mess out over this. People expected Tony Abbott to have his stance, but talkback radio around the country was quite savage against the Greens, and I didn't expect that at all. There were many Greens supporters and many undecided sort of people who, I'm not quite sure why, but they ended up blaming the Greens for being intransigent and for them not operating as a sort of a third party and going with the government to break the deadlock. And it was quite an unusual outcome in that debate. Quite unusual.
Well, but that's why. I mean, the Greens could have actually resolved that issue by voting with the government in the Senate on the Oakeshott piece of legislation. So there was an opportunity for the Greens to actually come up with an outcome that would have resolved the deadlock. And this is where I think they should be held accountable by the public. They try to be pure about these things all the time, but sometimes the price of purity is impotence, and I think that's where the Greens have to be held accountable. If they do these things, there is a price to pay. We'd have an emissions trading scheme now if the Greens hadn't have been so intransigent during Kevin Rudd's Prime Ministership. They really are a negative force in Australian politics, in many ways almost as bad as Tony Abbott when it comes to some of these big issues.
All right, we are out of time. Bruce Hawker and Grahame Morris, appreciate your insights as always.